I must not tell lies. That's the lesson Harry had to learn. Dolores Umbridge. How many have seen the movie before? Order of the Phoenix. Some of you. To me, it's like the best of the Harry Potter films. I think it's the most... it tells a lot of truth throughout the film about the nature of good and evil. And Harry was learning a little bit about the nature of good and evil in that particular scene. But not to get into the scene. I must not tell lies is a valuable lesson. I think we can all agree that it's something we would all be wise to teach ourselves, to remind ourselves on a daily basis. I must not tell lies. It seems to me that there's a man living in a giant white mansion a few hours east of here who could use this message. There was once a time when truth and honesty were simply assumed. There was once a time in our culture where we could read the paper or we could watch the evening news and we could simply take for granted that what we were hearing or what we were learning was the objective, plain truth. There was once a time when no one would ever imagine anything less than the truth to come from our elected officials, from our media, from our teachers, from our clergy. There was once a time when saying one thing and doing another had consequences. Today, however, in the minds of some at least, today, truth is simply one of many options. As long as a person means well, that's all that really matters, is what the world tells us. As long as nobody's offended, as long as everyone is kept happy, what does truth really matter at the end of the day? The ends justify the means, do they not? Does it really matter what people believe? Does it really matter what people know? Does it really matter if truth with a capital T, the plain truth, is ever declared? Jesus had something to say about the nature of truth. In fact, he spoke at large about truth throughout the Gospels. Repeatedly throughout the Gospel, we read of Jesus saying something like, I tell you the truth. In Mark chapter 3, we hear Jesus saying, I tell you the truth. All the sins and blasphemies of men will be forgiven them. Then in Mark 9, I tell you the truth. Anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name, because you belong to Christ, will certainly not lose his reward. And then in Matthew, I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. Repeatedly, throughout the Gospels, we hear Jesus saying, I tell you the truth. Truth was invaluable to Jesus. It culminates again, finally, in John chapter 14, where Jesus declares the following. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. You cannot read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and not know that Jesus was and is a man of truth. He declared truth. His very being was truth. But what happens when truth hurts? What happens when truth is self-incriminating? What happens when the honest truth is hard to hear? What happens when truth is sometimes flat out rejected? What do we do with truth? Billy was quite the bright and creative little boy. But sometimes, Billy's brilliance and creativity led him down a bit of a devious path. At just 8 years old, Billy loved mysteries, and having the occasional night where he stayed up a bit too late watching late-night television, Billy became infatuated with the mystery of Bigfoot. How could you not? Billy loved Bigfoot. In his free time, Billy would draw a Bigfoot. Billy would tell stories about Bigfoot. Billy wanted a Bigfoot for a pet. There was absolutely no question in Billy's mind that Bigfoots were real and an accepted fact in the world as he understood it. Unfortunately for Billy, his love for Bigfoot tended to get him in a bit of trouble. No matter how much Billy looked, no matter how much Billy searched, he could not find Bigfoot anywhere around where he lived. So like many adults, also fascinated with the subject, Billy had to resort to pretending he was friends with Bigfoot. We do this all the time. Once while swinging on a swing set in his backyard, Billy wondered what would happen if a gigantic 8-foot, 500-pound man-beast were to swing with him on the set. When Billy's mom discovered the swing all bound up around the top bar, she asked Billy what happened. Billy declared, "Well, Mom, Bigfoot came bounding through the yard and wanted to try the swings, but he was so big and so powerful, he swung it over the top bar and got scared away and ran away into the forest." Frustrated that her son would lie to her like this, Billy's mom grounded him for a week. On another occasion, Billy really wanted some cookies, but the cookie jar was just a bit too high and out of reach for him. Pretending that his long-armed, giant, hairy friend was with him to lift him towards the prize, Billy jumped and he jumped. But just as he was able to jump high enough to grab the jar, it came crashing to the floor and broke into 1,000 pieces. Demanding to know what happened, Billy explained to his mom again, "Bigfoot lifted me up to help me reach the cookies, but the jar slipped and the crash scared him off." That time, Billy wasn't allowed any dessert for a week. Then one day, Billy went with his family on a camping trip to the notorious Pacific Northwest. Billy was so excited to be in the land of Bigfoot. So excited to be there, in fact, that he spent most of his time searching the forest around the campsite, desperately looking for the stealthy, bipedal movements of this hairy man beast friend. While his family was sitting around the fire cooking lunch one day, Billy wandered off into the forest just a few yards away. And as Billy looked around, he noticed as a putrid smell filled the air. Not more than a minute later, Billy heard what sounded like a couple of knocks of wood and a howl louder than anything else he's ever heard. Billy knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, he wasn't alone. Billy's friend, the Bigfoot, was very near. Scared out of his mind, Billy ran back to his family sitting around the fire in tears. Worried that Billy somehow hurt himself, his dad scooped him up and asked, What happened? "Bigfoot's in the woods," he heard. He said to his dad. "He's here. Bigfoot's really here." Knowing all about the stories that Billy had a habit of telling and all the lies he's told his mother in the past, Billy's dad could only assume he was just making up another story. "Billy, I have to tell you, Bigfoot isn't real. Bigfoot is just in your head," his dad reassured his weeping son. "No, Dad," Billy exclaimed, "Bigfoot's real, and he's right back there. I know he is. I know he is. You can see him for yourself." Wanting to comfort his son, Billy's dad decided the best thing he could do was walk with his son back to the forest and show him that, in fact, everything was all in his head. Shivering with fear the entire time, Billy held tightly to his dad's hand as they journeyed back to the spot where Billy heard the sounds and smelled the stench of a very real, very alive Bigfoot. And just as they circled around a large fir tree, Billy's 6-foot-tall dad was dwarfed by the extremely large Bigfoot Billy heard moments prior, now standing right in front of them for them both to see with their plain eyes. Startled beyond words, Billy's dad scooped his son up and took 3 giant steps backwards. Not sure what to do, Billy and his dad watched as the giant, hairy man picked a few twigs from the fir tree out of his hair and threw them to the ground before walking away on 2 legs back into the forest. Not even 3 days later, Billy's home was swarmed with media as reporters demanded to have an interview with Billy. Billy, one reporter asked excitedly, "How did you know that Bigfoot was there? How did you possibly get the hair samples for your dad? Do you even realize what your dad's geneticist lab has just proved to the world? Your dad, the geneticist, has given you an 8-year-old boy full credit for one of the greatest scientific discoveries of all time. What do you have to say for yourself?" "I always knew Bigfoots were real," said Billy. And since that day, Billy's never been grounded again. Billy's dad had every reason to declare to his son that the truth in your mind is fake, that you're doing nothing but repeating lies after lies. Billy's dad had every reason to tell him that the truth as he understood it, the truth as this scientifically minded dad understood it, was that Bigfoot wasn't real. Billy had a clear history of making up stories. Billy's dad was a scientist. He knew through objective fact, through scientific reasoning, that there was no possible way that an 8-foot-tall, giant, hairy man is wandering the forest. He knew, as a scientist, it wasn't real. But rather than simply arguing with his son with pure truth and pure reason, Billy Billy's dad coupled that truth with grace and journeyed with his son to a place in which their lives and the world had changed. John writes this in John chapter 1, speaking of Jesus. He says, the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Grace and truth are what I call the power twins of the kingdom of God. Jesus came into the world as a man of truth. We know this. We've talked about this. He declared truth. He was a man who spoke truth. He fully embodied truth. He was the way, the truth, and the life. But Jesus also came into the world as a man of grace. He was full of grace, loved grace, identified entirely with grace. Grace and truth in their purest sense are fully realized in the life of Jesus. And anyone who chooses to follow Jesus, anyone who dares to call him or herself a disciple of Jesus, is challenged and commanded to be a person of both grace and truth. One without the other. Grace without truth, or truth without grace, cannot, on its own, glorify God. It can't. Truth without grace is intellectual abuse. That's all it is. Truth without grace is intellectual abuse. There is only so much a person can take when we're constantly berated and preached at ruthlessly about the differences between right and wrong. Lives rarely, if ever, change out of purely rational arguments, based purely on truth and reason. But at the same time, grace without truth is emotional deceit. Grace without truth is nothing more than emotional deceit. If you are simply somebody who wants to love another person without any type of truth-filled basis for that love, there is no progress to be made for the kingdom of God in that relationship. You gain nothing if there is no truth embodied in your love for another human being. Lives rarely, if ever, change as a result of baseless grace. Just grace alone. The only way that truth and grace honor the kingdom of God, the only way truth and grace glorify God, is if they are delivered together in a complete package, as one, together. And I think Jesus exemplifies this truth in the story that comes from John chapter 8. John writes this, as Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives. But early the next morning he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd, saying, "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one of you who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." Jesus bestowed grace on the woman caught in adultery. The law clearly stated that she should have been stoned to death for her sins. That's what the Pharisees had brought this woman out to Jesus all for, was to declare for them once and for all that there was truth in the law, that truth had to be upheld, that truth had to play itself out in the form of justice. But during the interaction, this most famous interaction that we know of Jesus, Jesus bestows grace upon the woman. And by doing so, he also bestows grace on the Pharisees by asking the question, the one who did without sin may be the first one to throw a stone. Because they knew that by him asking that, they were all condemned of sin in one form or another. They were all guilty of sin. Whether it was adultery or something else entirely, they were all as guilty as the woman who was caught red-handed. So Jesus bestowed grace by asking that rhetorical question. He saved the woman's life, and he made the Pharisees start to think. But yet he also maintained his adherence to truth when he told the woman to go and sin no more. He loved the woman enough to say, you can't continue life like this. Life cannot go on with these kinds of mistakes. You need to move on in your life. You need to live a life that honors God. You need to honor yourself. So go and sin no more. Jesus was a man of grace, but he was also a man of truth. And he honored both in this scenario. Throughout the past few weeks, we've been replacing the question of what am I thankful for this Thanksgiving with the question of what is God thankful for in us? And if you're here the past couple of weeks, you know that 2 weeks ago we said that God is thankful for us whenever we step out and we act with courageous faith. That we look at our circumstances and we do not allow reason or objective reasoning to determine how we're going to act. We decide we're going to step outside the boat and we're going to walk with Christ as our goal, and we're going to walk in faith. God is thankful for us when we step out in courageous faith. And last week we discussed how you can have all the courageous faith you want in the world, but God needs to see in you a willing sacrifice. That if all the courageous faith is all about you, if you're just going to pursue riches, if you're just going to pursue security, if you're just going to continue to pursue things that you want and be courageous in pursuing what you want, that is of no value to the kingdom of God unless you're willing to sacrifice all that you are, all that you own, and everything that makes you you for the kingdom of God. Courageous faith, a willing sacrifice. God gives thanks for his people whenever we demonstrate these things. And lastly, the last lesson we need to learn through this series about what is God thankful for in us is that God gives thanks. God is overjoyed when his people are people of grace and truth. Grace and truth. This Thanksgiving, as you're enjoying time with family and friends, we should be all people of grace and truth. Some of you are going to have dinner or maybe enjoy a meal or some time with family and friends maybe you haven't seen in a while. Perhaps you're going to be sitting around a table with people you think completely different than. Or you're going to be sitting around a table with people who have lived a totally different lifestyle than you. People who live lifestyles that you and I might say are more worldly than us. You need to be a person of grace and truth in those situations. You need to be a person who sits around that table and loves the people sitting around there at that table with you with all that you are. Being completely present in the moment. Loving them as God created them, as the children of God. As the children of God that they are. Love them. Be a person of grace. But when opportunities arise and you are given opportunities to speak truth or be a representative of truth, you are called by God to do just that. When maybe an uncle of yours is having a little bit too much to drink and he's starting to ruin the night for the rest of the family, it may be you who needs to stand up and ask gracefully, is enough enough? Are you going to ruin the rest of the evening for us by continuing to drink? Or maybe there's a friend of yours who's going to just start talking about other people and just being a person of gossip and just belittling those other people around the table, people who aren't even there. God may be giving you an opportunity to gracefully speak up and say, maybe we should just speak positively about others this evening. Maybe we should just encourage family unity. Maybe we shouldn't be belittling one another. This week you're going to have an opportunity unlike any other to be a person of grace and truth, because many of you are going to interact with people you don't normally interact with on a daily basis. So I encourage you to be thinking about this as we go into Thanksgiving. How can I be a person of grace? How can I be a person of truth? How can I couple that in a cohesive package as I'm sitting around the table with people that need to know the kingdom of God? How do I couple all that together? Maintaining the balance of grace and truth is not easy. And we will more often than not lean towards one over the other. Some of us, we know in our personality type, some of us are people who tend towards truth and don't know how to bring grace in or struggle to bring grace into the scenario. We know what right and wrong looks like. We've seen the world in black and white, and so we like to point out error and lead people towards a correct style of living or a better style of living. Your challenge this week is to be a person of grace. Find a way to discipline yourself to be a person of grace and bring grace in with that true personality that you have. Others of you are people of grace who absolutely love to just love people And regardless of who they are, you love them entirely as they are, and you just hold them tight, and you just love them as they are. Your challenge this week is to figure out a way to speak truth, or demonstrate truth, perhaps, into a scenario in which you may not otherwise be comfortable doing so. It's absolutely vital that we prayerfully consider how we might be people of grace and truth, not only this week, but throughout our lives, so that we might glorify God in all that we do and expand the kingdom as much as we possibly can. Let's close with a word of prayer.